Welcome to our channel Top Reddit Story. Make sure to subscribe our channel and leave a comment down below saying I subscribed, and we will try our hardest to reply your comment. What is an example of the butterfly effect that happened in your life? Around 5 years ago I was going to live in Australia for around a year. As part of a student exchange program. I would have been able to leave for Australia earlier. But I had troubles organizing my visa. The visa couldn't come from my national government for some reason. And had to go through the German bureaucracy. The delay meant that I had to leave 1 week later than originally planned. I had to reschedule flights. Which was a large nuisance at the time. The original flight I would have been on would have been flight MH17 from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur that was shot down with a rocket above Ukraine by pro-Russian separatists. Everybody on that flight had died. I took flight MH19 instead. Thanks to the delay caused by slow bureaucracy. I would have died had I gotten my visa on time. I had a crush on a guy when I was in 5th grade. He was a grade ahead of me. I finally told my parents about the crush. They ended up befriending crush's parents. My dad started working for crush's dad. My dad borrowed crush's dad's work van for a job and went to return it and then ride his bike home. He fell off his bike during that ride and died 2 weeks later. My mom, a few months later, starts having an affair with crush's dad, who was and still is married. That was 16 years ago and it's still going on. Drunkenly agreed at a party the night before to go visit my friend's parents with him the next day in a city 200 miles away. It turned out another friend lived close by, so we all met for drinks that evening and said other's friend's sister happened to be visiting him for the weekend. She came to meet us as she'd not seen me for a few years. We got drunk. Friend left early as he had work the next day. His sister didn't. And 9 years later we are married with 2 kids. A series of events which had one of any part not happened would have significantly altered the course of my life. This one is pretty literal, but I was walking in a state park when this iridescent blue butterfly set down on the path in front of me. I decided to squat down to get a better look at it, and as I did, a huge 15-foot tree branch fell down a few steps ahead of me on the trail where I would have been had I not stopped to say oh hello butterfly. Mum and father split when I had turned 15. Father remarried a few years later, and with that I had a step family. I put a good word in for my now stepsister where I worked. She was cool, so thought I'd help her out. A few months later her friend is looking for work and she puts a good work in for her. Her friends joins our workplace. I now have 2 children with her friend and couldn't be happier, with our own marriage to come very soon. Literally blows my mind to think that if my parents never split, I wouldn't have found my soulmate. This happened the other day. I went to go pick up some weed from my buddy. As I'm driving back home he calls me asking if his keys are in my truck. I tell him to hold on, I'll pull over and look and call him back. I get off the highway. As I'm getting off the highway the car ahead of me but to the left merged into my lane and clipped the person ahead of me, causing an accident. If I had stayed on the highway I would have been involved in that accident most likely. My weed dealer losing his keys in my truck led to me not being in a wreck. I dropped dead at work 15 minutes after arriving. I was given CPR by co-workers and the paramedics got my heart working again. 3 weeks later, I'm out of the hospital and making a full recovery. Had this happened 15 minutes earlier, I'd have been in my car and possibly killed someone. 15 minutes later, I might be walking to get coffee and drop dead in the middle of the street. This was a job I had not planned on keeping very long, as I freelance and was in the midst of a slow season. This job is also the first job to give me health insurance in 15 years. Every single thing I did in my life up until that point, every alcoholic drink, every cigarette in college, every toke of pot and night shift, and every cheeseburger, got my heart to stop at the best possible moment. Surrounded by the best possible people. 6 years ago I decided to stay home instead of going to class because I was feeling sick. I was bored out of my mind and opened the app store on my iPad to look for a game to download. For some reason I still don't know. There was a karaoke app in the recommended section. I had never done karaoke. Never sung in front of anyone before or let anyone hear me sing. For that matter. It took me about 4 months just to gather the courage to actually use it and sing because I've always been self-conscious about my voice. I made a lot of friends and sang a bunch. One of these friends showed me a song. Just because it was in Spanish, my first language, from a user I didn't know or follow, I knew the song. But I never liked it, so I didn't give it much thought and didn't sing it. The next day I remembered about it and said, "Duck it. I'll sing it anyways just because it's in Spanish." As soon as I heard her voice I melted and fell in love with it. She thanked me for joining and that was it. Fast forward to today. I married the woman with a Spanish song I almost didn't sing. Moved to another country. Adopted a cat and I'm happier than I've ever been. I'm still amazed that the simplest decision I made out of boredom changed my whole life. Edit, added details. When I first applied to a community college, they rejected me because I had only partially completed high school. This was a special college for adults and you didn't need a full high school diploma and I had misread how much I needed to have completed, so I gave up on education. Again. Seeing as I had been nothing but a failure in academia when I used to go to school. My mom was having none of it. She called the school and somehow convinced them to let me in. Probably told them about my crippling depression and how much I needed this. Turns out I wasn't bad at this academia thing. It was 7 years ago and I'm finishing medical school next year with all of my research and hopefully residency in neurosurgery after. I also met Miso at this school as she was visiting her friend who I went to class with. And we have a beautiful son together. Had my mom not decided to make that phone call, I would be living an entirely different life. If I would be living at all, I wasn't kidding about that depression. It was quite severe. While in high school I came across a post in an online forum that mentioned a university in another country. Looked up the place and immediately found a course that I found interesting. After finishing high school a couple of years later, I moved there. The course turned out to be completely not for me and I do something else now. But have been in the same country for 7-8 years. Wondering what life would be like if I wasn't clicking around on some gaming forum around 10 years ago. I was at a summer camp and didn't like the food there, so I faked a stomachache. A girl came to ask if I was okay. Now she is one of my best friends. A few days later I was talking to her about weeaboo stuff. And a guy overheard us and joined us. He is now my boyfriend. Most of their friends are now my friends too, so I wouldn't have any social life at all if I finished eating my food in silence. My mom died of a sudden brain aneurysm a month before my 13th birthday. My dad didn't know what to get me as a present. So he got me like 6 prepaid horseback riding lessons at a local barn despite me never having really ridden before and having a non-horsey family. Yeah. I'm now 30, I'm a multiple world champion equestrian. And I own a ranch and 8 horses. There is a whole lot of stuff in between. But if my mom hadn't have died that day at work, I imagine my entire life would be different. Got accepted into UCLA for microbiology for the spring. I wanted to finish my volunteer hours at the hospital before going. I got assigned to the lab, mostly just filing paperwork. The microbiologists in the lab didn't study microbiology, they studied clinical laboratory science. So I withdrew from UCLA and went to a smaller California State University that offered that major and became a CLS. Got involved with a professional Facebook group for CLSs. Saw this girl with the same last name with me. She was a student. She hit me up asking me for help since I seemed to be answering people's questions on that group. After a month I flew out across the country to meet her. We stayed in the hotel for a week and did nothing but duck. Now we're married with a kid. I probably wouldn't have met her if I didn't finish my volunteer hours. Or got placed in another department. Or went to UCLA for microbiology. Which I would have most likely ended up in research or manufacturing. Instead of medical clinical lab. Plot twist, I dabbled in macro for a while. but fell in love with blood banking and transfusion. Currently I'm in med school, but I'll never forget the fun I had in the lab. When I was a kid, my parents had a pretty good life for themselves in Mexico. Then they got caught up in this sounds too good to be true pyramid scheme that was too good to be true. They pretty much lost everything. All their savings, their house, and there were a few people that were pissed at them for getting them involved in that scheme. One woman in particular became obsessed with my mom, calling all the time, leaving threatening notes at the door, and even showing up at places we were going. My parents started to worry that she might try to do something to harm me. So they decided to move to the US, far away from her, and start over. Had my parents not gotten involved in that pyramid scheme, which got that crazy lady after them, causing them to pack up and move to another country, my life could be so much different right now. I often wonder how things would have been for me if I had grown up in Mexico instead of Chicago. When I was in college, my friend wanted to go out to party. We went out a lot in college and I wasn't in the mood to go, but after going at it back and forth I decided to go last minute. Met a girl at that party. Got her number. Eventually she became my girlfriend after a year. Completely changed my life. Life's weird. Always go to the college party. My ex and I hadn't talked in years, having lived across the country from each other and dating other people in the meantime. There was a point where we were both single and mutual feelings were still there, so we decided to give it a try again. Things went horrible. But it was one of those situations where those what if feelings would have always been there had we not tried. I mean, we're talking like 10 years of history at this point. Anyways, I was in my hometown, where he lived, visiting, and he ended things, but asked me to stay in town for another day. I stayed. Didn't hear from him at all that next day and was hurt. But it showed me how toxic our relationship had become. So that night I went to my best friend's house to say goodbye, because I wouldn't be back in town until later in the year. I told her that after all those years of being hung up on one person, I was finally ready to move on. Her response? But there's someone we want you to meet. They invited said person over. I'd never met or heard of him. Flash forward 2 years, him and I are still together, about to move across the country with our 2 pups. If I hadn't been dumb enough to stay that extra night, I don't think I would have gotten fed up enough to tell myself that I deserved better, and I would have never been around to meet the love of my life. There are so many more dominoes that fell into place to get me to be there that night. But the biggest heartbreak of my life brought me the best thing that ever happened to me. I always think about how I nearly missed meeting my husband if my choices had been slightly different. I went to university, and they had enrolled me on the wrong course. I left my tiny town to go to a big city 5 hours away. The course I had been enrolled on only lasted a year and I had no choice but to go back home. I went home. My asshole mother told me I had a week to find a job or duck off. So I found a job as a carer. Had never done this in my life. It was a quick job with a quick start, and still ducked off. This care job meant I lived with people who needed 24-hour care for weeks on end. I didn't do small stints because I didn't have a car. The last lady I was with had passed away and they needed me to go to another who was just down the road from me, and didn't need a live-in. So it worked well. I'd sit with her for 8 hours a day. I remember laughing at her last name because it was just odd. Little did I know 5 years later I'd be marrying her grandson and gaining the weird name lol. A good friend of mine is only alive today because I sat down with him at a party and we got drunk together. I'd never met him before and I don't know. Just sat down with him and cracked open a beer. Turns out he'd recently lost his father too, and we bonded over the meaninglessness of existence. Years later he told me he'd planned to kill himself until I'd said nothing matters as long as you have beer and good company. 17 years later we're still here. Switching my spring sport from t-ball to lacrosse all the way back in 1st grade. I found the college I will be attending this fall through lacrosse recruitment. I never would have heard about this school otherwise. It's a small school that's 10 hours away from my hometown and I am absolutely thrilled to be going there. I quit my security supervisor job because I got a job at a casino. The casino laid me off due to the expansion not happening. Needed a quick job. So I went to my former employer to see if I could get any security post. As I went in the door, a guy was being escorted out by my former boss. I asked him if I could get a job and he said that I could have my former position started right now. The guy he was throwing out was my replacement and was being fired for stealing Twinkies from the production line at the hostess plant where we had a security guard contract. My new first assignment was a bank escort for a manager at a branch office for a large company. After a few months, he told me about an entry-level management job and he helped me get in. I still work at the company and I have just started my 23 year. I will probably retire in just 5 more years. Now the reason I work security at all though was because I had a pen with me one day. I went to the local mall to apply for jobs after high school. I stopped at the security office first and they needed a dispatcher. They had a rule that you could only apply if you had your own pen. Shows planning or something like that. I had a pen and I got the job. First job I ever applied for I got because I had pen. Since I had security work experience it led to security jobs all through college. So having the pen put in the right place for when the guy stole the Twinkies. I conmaried my home and had a bunch of stuff to take to the car. Did not want to take multiple trips so I carried everything down at once. Fell down the stairs and bruised my tailbone. Thus altered my gait and now I have low back pain which referred up to my shoulders. I wake up in pain and had to purchase a new mattress as well as start seeing a physical therapist. Not a very exciting story. My ex cheated on me big time. So to see her Instagram profile after we broke up, I created an Instagram account and would usually go through her pictures and stuff. I missed her. While scrolling on the app, I saw a witty comment and thought it was hilarious. I DM'd this girl off an Instagram comment. We started talking. We decided to meet after speaking for a month or so. We instantly clicked. We are about to complete 2 years together this May. Best relationship of my life. I was at Lollapalooza in Chicago in 2012. It was the summer before my sophomore year of college. It started to rain so much that we had to evacuate the park for a couple of hours. They were going to text us or something when it was back on. I ran into someone from my college. We had gone to one EDM concert during my freshman year where we hung out all night but we didn't exchange numbers. I ran into him on a random street in Chicago and we exchanged numbers. A couple weeks later we went to an EDM festival together. Then during my sophomore and junior years we went to a lot of EDM concerts together. Him and I and his high school friends. It was a super fun period of time in my life. Though sadly in June 2014 he decided to ghost me for an EDM festival and we had a falling out. He had moved away from campus to Chicago and I feel like he had decided during his senior year, he is a year older than me, that he wanted to cut ties with college friends. But I am grateful for all of the other good times we had. I was in Nick for work and staying in Lower Manhattan. But just felt like it was too far from work, that's all I was there for. I was too busy for anything fun. Plus I've been to Nick numerous times before. So one night I just decided to move hotels closer to the office. The next morning in the new hotel I overslept and didn't wake up until about 9 AM. I made the switch on the evening of the 10th of September, 2001 and had been staying at the Marriott World Trade Center. I had a summer internship lined up in another state. The month before. The internship fell through and I no longer had any summer plans. I found a last-minute internship in the city I lived in. Right before summer vacation started. My boyfriend broke up with me, leaving me devastated. At my internship, my co-worker turned me to Bumble, which I had always said I would never use. I tried it for fun to get me through the summer and planned to delete the app before school started. There were 2 weeks of summer vacation left and I matched with a guy. We had a drink and hit it off. At that time he was ready to give up and stop online dating altogether. 4 years later we're still dating and about to move in together. a friend who worked in Madrid. As she got to the train station, the strap on her shoe broke, so she only lived 10 minutes away and went home for different shoes. In the 20 or so minutes it took her to go there, grab shoes and go back again. 193 people died and 2,000 were injured in GOMS, including on the train she would have got on. My dad was completely in love with a lady called Carol. He had moved from a nearby city to her small town to live and be with her and was soon going to propose. Then, one day, Carol crashed her motorcycle and died instantly. My dad didn't leave the town he was new to. He stayed, grieved, worked, settled and eventually met my mum there. Carol's hometown is my hometown. And I am only here because she was. And then wasn't. My dad made me promise as a child that I'd never set foot on a motorcycle, and even though I don't believe them to be the death machines that he insisted they were, and even though he's no longer with me, I will keep that promise. For Carol. Didn't happen to me but to my ancestors. Like my mother, grandparents possibly. They were late for a ship they were supposed to be on, so they were unable to board. It ended up sinking. Had they not missed the boat, I wouldn't be here. Not me but my work partner. We were chems. He locked his keys in his car and a couple guys spent about 30 minutes trying to get to it. We logged on about 10 minutes late due to it. Well, our first call was a lady who wanted to go to a hospital 30 minutes away, where my partner's wife worked. But she wasn't working that day and was out and about and happened to be in the vicinity of her work with his keys. She had to use them because she locked herself out of her car and the ring has the sets. If we didn't log on late, we never would have gotten the call to go to that far away hospital. We never would have gotten his wife to meet us. No keys. Not a crazy story but still interesting. Train operators of Reddit. What's the strangest, creepiest thing you've seen on the tracks? I'm an engineer now, but as a conductor I was walking my train one midnight lacing air hoses getting the cars, freight, ready to pull. I noticed what I thought was a dog or coyote about 100 yards away. No big deal. I have a big aluminum and steel stick with a hook for cranking brakes without having to climb onto the cars. Then I notice it kind of tracing along, pacing me. I could see the glow of its eyes watching me. Later, as we're ready to depart, I'm out in front of the engine opening the track switch to get onto the main line. I'm in the engine's headlights and I hear my engineer say quietly over the radio, calmly walk up to the engine. If I blow the whistle, run. I'm thinking, oh geez, it's just that coyote. No big deal, and I keep working, but he starts flashing the cab lights, so I think maybe there's a manager stalking us, so I go up there. He has me close the nose door and points out a giant mountain lion perched up on a berm 20 feet from where I was. Casually sprawled out, staring dead at us. This was northern Iowa, so pretty uncommon. That and a bunch of junkies and drunks around the yards. 1:30 AM in Riverside, California. A very clearly drunk man squares off against my train and then opens his arms like he is accepting what is about to happen. Fell over and got out of the way just, and I mean just before we hit him. Thankfully I have never hit someone yet, but that was the closest I have ever come. It's not the hit or the recovery. It's the nightmares months later. I remember one time a Metro, Chicago area commuter train driver was being interviewed by the news after his train hit a car on the tracks. The reporter asked, "What did you do when you saw the car on the tracks?" His reply was, "I hit the emergency brake. Then got on my phone and called 911. Saw a body wearing a thick coat in the middle of the tracks. We put the train in emergency, but we didn't stop in time. The conductor got out to see if the person was still alive, and it wasn't a person at all. Someone put a ducking coat on a deer carcass and put it between the rails. Weirdest sheet ever." Not an operator, but a girl tried to moon an oncoming train. She was struck and killed. Her parents tried to sue for dangerous conditions. Live next to tracks. Big rig tried to rush across the tracks to avoid waiting. The trucker was fine as the train ran right through the middle of the trailer. It was filled with those 10-cent paper folders. Looked like a Skittles commercial. Rainbow explosion. This could have gone so much worse. I don't know if it counts or not, but I used to do modifications for trains and rewires and then test them and drive them about a mile to terminal that took them and drove them back to where they needed to go. Most of the time we would walk back after dropping them off since we were hourly and had a private track until where we dropped it off, so there wasn't danger of getting ran over. On the way back there was a big puddle with a decent sized fish swimming in it. There wasn't a lake anywhere on the property and it never flooded for one to swim there. Me and the guy I worked with figured a bird must have dropped it there or someone put it there because we couldn't imagine any other way it got there. I was a young transportation supervisor trainee for a railroad. It was my first month in intercity Detroit. It was about 3 AM and I had to help inspect a train that was having trouble moving. It was winter and the brakes wouldn't release. The guy I was training with dropped me off at one end of the train and I started walking towards the locomotives. About 20 cars into the train I started hearing footsteps on the other side. I would turn my lantern off and wait a few seconds and they would stop. This repeated for about 10 minutes as I walked towards the locomotives. It eventually stopped when I met up part of the train crew. I'm sure it was nothing. Probably a coyote or stray dog. But I was freaked out. When I was 8 years old, obviously not a train operator, I lived close to train tracks in a secluded farm area. One day I was walking along the tracks with a bunch of friends and we see kittens on the tracks. Once we were close enough we could see that many were cut into bits or crushed, while others were left whole in the middle of the tracks but dead as well, likely from shock. There were probably around 8 of them total. They looked to be a month or 2 old and there was a box next to the tracks. Some sick piece of sheep placed them there and I will never know why, since we never had trouble getting litters of kittens adopted. It was a tough sight and an early lesson on how ducked people can be. Also, on a less depressing note, years later a train managed to lose some cargo from an open bay door or something, scattering umbrellas for a few hundred feet alongside the tracks. Of all the things in the world, it had to be dollar store umbrellas. Most of them were broken too. And of course the one thing that this site always lacks: proof. Imga.com. I've recently qualified as a train driver after a year of training and heard a few stories from other drivers and my own time in the industry that stuck with me. One driver had a jumper that ended up partially in the cab with him. 2, someone ended up pretty much decapitated after getting into a driver's compartment that has a drop window and sticking their head out of it. 3, before coming over I worked in stations. One of the stations had 3 fatalities in 2 weeks. Someone who was jumping over the tracks to change platform when an empty service ran through, and the one that really sticks with me: a mum who walked off the platform into the path of a fast train whilst holding her baby. Not so much strange creepy, but we have third rail here, a live rail carrying 750 DC on the ground that trains pull from to run. And if a badger brushes against it, it gets a bit of a zap. The badger will then turn around and bite down on its attacker, the third rail, and electrocute itself as soon as its jaws close on the rail that DC keeps it clamped on. Not an operator, but this totally counts. My best friend lives on a rural private road that crosses 2 of the most active rail lines in my part of the state. There have been at least 3 accidental deaths from auto train collisions. But a year ago, 2 cars crossed the tracks right before a train. The first car had a middle-aged mom in it. She speeds over the tracks. The second car had her son and his girlfriend, mid-20s. The second car darts in front of the train and is obliterated. NTSB. Sheriff and BNSF arrived to investigate. The mother is hysterical, saying he was right behind me the whole time. They originally thought it was just another unfortunate case of someone trying to outrun the train, until they discovered the mom and son are from a city over an hour away. No one locally knew them. They didn't have permission to be on that private road. And then they found that the girlfriend had been dead for hours. They suspected the mom was helping her murder her son try to find a dump spot to dispose of the body. Not a locomotive engineer but a train rider. I'm an electrician riding the train for quality control. Coming back from Quebec City, we are riding at approx 50 kph. On a winding curve around a hill we see a lady on a dog sled with her 4 dogs caught on the track. Before I even saw her, the engineers were standing up. screaming obscenities and honking the horn and emergency horn. She managed to pry her sled free and drag the dogs out of the way within mere feet of us hitting her. Not an engineer and neither is my friend, but he was hit by a train many years ago. This isn't actually his story because he doesn't remember that day. The story comes from the engineer and a farmer who saw it happen. My friend was a plumber on his way to work in his work van. It was cold and his side windows were fogged up. He stopped at the crossing but must not have seen the train coming. The train was only doing about 30 miles per hour. When the train hit the van, it made the van barrel roll on the tracks about 15-20 times before the van finally went off the tracks and settled in a ditch. This was before seat belts, so he was rolling in the van with all the plumber tools and toolboxes. He is just covered in scars but lucky to be alive. The funny part of the story is when the farmer ran to him. My friend ran to the farmer and begged him to help him keep his overalls from falling down. He didn't realize he had just survived getting hit by a train. He was just worried about people seeing him naked. I used to be a shunter for QI years ago. We were reversing a passenger train back onto a platform and had to go over a crossing. I saw a guy stumbling towards the crossing. There was a pub on the other side of the crossing he was trying to get to. He looked at us coming back and decided to run right at the last second as we were already coming through the crossing. I called for the train to stop and jumped off the train to get to him the second he started running as I was watching him, and he got hit by one of the bumpers as the coupler stretched out. He was out cold on the ground with the wheels about 6 inches away from his torso. Holy shit, that one had me rocked for a while. I was told this story by my dad, and sorry, the story was almost 30 years ago so the details are fuzzy. My dad was a motorman, engineer, for the Chicago Transit Authority. He came home very late one day, which was unusual, and at dinner told me and my mom that some guy was down on the tracks dancing on the third rail, the electrified rail, and this guy, due to being on the tracks, forced my dad to stop his train. While stopped and waiting for the cops. Since my dad already called it into dispatch, the guy was just waltzing around dancing on the third rail in the front of my dad's train. Eventually authorities got the guy, but if he'd made proper contact with the third rail, the guy would have been super dead. Fun fact, my dad radioed in the downtown flood back in the late 80s early 90s. The flood is on one of the modern Marvel's engineering disasters episodes. Was a conductor running the rail from one town to another with a couple of passengers. We went through a tunnel and saw strange creepy lights and heard strange noises. When we got to the next town and I told the station about it, they informed me there was no tunnel on my route. Where the hell did my train go and what the duck did we see and hear? In 1985, my wife and I were traveling across Tanzania to Lake Tanganyika when the train struggled to halt going up a grade in the night. We were the only non-Africans on the train. People started yelling to close the windows. Thieves had put palm oil on the tracks, stopping the train, and were on the roof trying to rob people through the windows. There were a lot of armed soldiers on the train and the thieves quickly disappeared into the night. People walked along and poured sand on the tracks so the train had enough traction to climb the grade past the oil. Not my story, but a colleague. A kangaroo got hit by a train and got stuck in the front coupler. The crew couldn't see it from the cab, so the train drove through the middle of the CBD with half a dead kangaroo swinging from the front of a packed peak time commuter train. My dad worked for the railroad for years running a crane truck to fix train cars and derailments. Part of the areas he worked was North and South Dakota. Apparently in a few of the Indian reservations out there, it was pretty common for the locals to get drunk in town and walk the train tracks at night and pass out on the tracks. I can't imagine getting drunk enough not to wake up to a train. Then again, I don't think I've ever been drunk enough to pass out outside in winter. Train ran pretty close behind the farm I used to live on. There were these marble-sized, perfectly sphere-shaped iron gonads. My dad said they were from a nasty train derailment right behind our farm when my father was a young child living on the same farm. Nothing creepy about it other than I heard people got hurt during the derailment. As far as I understand it, the sphere-shaped metal gonads were from a mine on the way to a smeltery. They were perfect for using with my slingshot. My dad was a train driver for most of his life. We live in the Netherlands where towns are really close by each other, so a train would go back and forth multiple times a day. Sometimes even every hour. So early one morning, he spots a person sitting near the train tracks. You can't really stop a train, so he radios it in for others to keep an eye out. On the return trip, he slows down as he passes the spot and notices the person is wearing pajamas. It was still very early at that point. On the following pass up again, he slows the train down to crawl and for sure. So dad stops the train, announces to the early morning commuters that there is a slight technical problem, and gets out to talk to the person. Turns out the person was a patient of the nearby mental institution and was going to plan to commit suicide by train. So dad convinces him not to and takes him back to the institution. He apparently said something like, "Hey, are you missing a patient because I found him or her? I don't remember the gender." He gets back to his train, announces the technical issues are solved and continues working for the day. My dad was a great guy. 14 years old and messing around with a buddy in a train switching yard and figured we would open the back of one of the train cars to see what was in it. Not necessarily to burglarize it, but we figured it would be an adventure. Break the seal, open the doors, and we're immediately buried in literally tons of split peas. Scared the living shit out of us. And we had to swim out from under this 10-foot tall avalanche, which was not easy to do. Literally the closest I'd ever come to death at that point in my life. I've always wondered how our parents would have dealt with their sons being drowned in peas in a rail yard. Not a train operator, but a train mechanic. Anyways, I was inspecting the signaling equipment underneath a locomotive, and on one of the signal pickup bars had a human hand resting on it. We called the police and later found out that the hand was from a man who committed suicide by jumping in front of the train. This engine was several back, so the hand went unnoticed. I worked as a train conductor several years ago. Hitting people or cars always sucked, but as far as strangest creepiest, I caught a freight train from our home terminal to our away terminal in the middle of the night. Along the way we saw something small and black on the track. But it was very small and obviously not moving. Looked like an old trash bag. Maybe cloth or maybe a blown out tire. Nothing out of the usual, people throw crap on the rails all the time. Road switcher crew went on duty the next morning over that section of track. Turns out there was a kid in that jacket. And all the trains that ran that night had went over him without realizing it was a person. Reminded me of what Tom Cruise said in Collateral about a guy dying on a train and nobody noticing until 2 days later. I work on long-haul passenger trains as a conductor. While I usually don't see us hitting things, I've only hit animals thus far. I absolutely hear it if it goes under the train and sends the ballast flying. We hit something a week ago and as usual I heard the ballast. But whatever we hit was flung into the undercarriage right where I was standing. So I felt it. A driver told us he hit a kangaroo but didn't hill it, and it wedged into the front of the train for a couple minutes before being jostled out and under. He said the screaming still gave him nightmares. They also have an axe in their cabin specifically to hill an animal quicker if it's maimed but not outright hilled by the train. Usually only horses and cows have a chance to survive. I work as a driver in Australia. Many years ago on a remote section of track we passed by two cars with headlights on just in the tree line about 40 meters from the track. They appeared to be digging. Didn't occur to me until days later why they may have been digging in the middle of night, in a remote area. Driving through a wildfire. It was right beside the tracks and they closed it down shortly after I went through. Also happened to be the biggest wildfire on record in British Columbia, Canada. Not an operator, but I work track maintenance. Our work train had just pulled out of the track next to us while we were working nights one night, so I just decided to stroll down that track alongside where our machines were working. It was a rough town, so you always expect junk and booze along the tracks. Figuring I had enough light between machines, I went without my headlamp and walked past this lone boot dead center of the track. I remember thinking to myself, some poor homeless guy out there is stumbling around out there bootless. Well, as it turns out, not too much farther down the track our lead machine calls out for a civilian next to our track. After a second or two you hear his voice go cold and we decided to walk up and investigate. Turns out some drunk had been crawling under the work train as it pulled out, dragging and mangling his body pretty badly. His top half was separated. On the lower half one leg was unrecognizable, but the other I noticed was missing a foot. Lo and behold, that was the boot I had walked past just moments before. Foot still inside. Kinda creepy that in the dark I had managed to miss a body not 10 feet off the track I was walking on. I use my headlamp every time now. I work for one of the busiest train operators in the UK. Not to get too specific, but 2 months into the job I had a teenage girl jump. I see it coming a mile away, but bombing 100 miles per hour down the main line, it was impossible to stop. She pulled her hood over her face and jumped. That was a rough day. Luckily I had a conductor with me who was very supportive until management and police arrived. I carried on with my day. Otherwise I don't think I would have operated a train again. The creepy part in this is the feeling you have knowing what is about to happen and seeing the person's face.